Well, the Liberal sideshow rolls on. Speculation, of course, mounts as to whether frontbencher Andrew Hastie wants to have a go at the leadership just months after Sussan Ley was installed. Well, Hastie did his best to hose that down this morning. He managed to do what Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price couldn't and give his support to his leader.
Look, I support Sussan. Anyone who's speculating otherwise is being mischievous. My main concern is that the centre-right is fragmenting. We've seen the rise in the One Nation vote and other micro-parties, and having us fragmented on the right is very strategically advantageous for Labor. And so I'm simply saying what people out on the street are looking for in their political leadership.
He's talking there to Mark Levy on 2GB, and I'll come back to his comments in a moment about the right fragmenting, because he's certainly not wrong about that. But Levy also asked him whether Sussan Ley had spoken to him about his recent comments on policy, including car manufacturing and net zero.
Look, by answering that question, and I'm not being tricky, but I just don't want to start a whole bunch of speculation. So my conversations with the leader are private. I want to respect that.
Well, he says he doesn't want to be tricky, but I'm going to mark that up as a tricky and, non-answer, basically. I mean, if he'd spoken to Ley, he could simply have said yes and then brought that answer out if he was probed about the contents of their conversation. So whether or not they've spoken, well, who knows? Now, look, he's done his best there, but this isn't going to stop speculation that Hastie is interested in the leadership. Now, it's easy to want to see things in black and white, but in politics, as in life, the reality is somewhere in the shades of grey, or maybe, in this case, the shades of blue. Now, for his part, former Liberal Minister Arthur Sinodinos told the ABC this morning that people like Hastie and Nampijinpa-Price need to forget about the culture wars.
There's been too much focus on the culture wars and not enough focus on the bread and butter issues that impact Australians. The Liberal Party should understand that, Australia is very much a centrist country. It's not Labor light to be towards the centre. If you go towards the centre, you're seeking to maximise your vote. You will not find a poultice of votes out on the extreme right. It doesn't exist.
Now, he said they're extreme right. What exactly does he mean by extreme right? What exactly does he mean by these culture wars instead of bread and butter issues? Because by and large, the things I've seen Hastie and co talking about are bread and butter issues, or at least they're heavily linked to bread and butter issues. Migration, net zero. I mean, on migration, it should be an obvious winner for the coalition. We saw polling just last week saying that half the country thinks migration is too high and only 5% think it's not enough. That's an issue that's clearly linked to the cost of living, which is about as bread and butter gets, and likewise net zero. Now, I get that's a harder one for the coalition to prosecute, particularly in the face of teal seats, etc., but it is still inextricably linked to the cost of living. And it's up to those talking about net zero to make that link and make that argument convincingly. I don't think Hastie or Senator Price have been trying to engage in culture wars. I think they've been voicing pretty mainstream views on migration and other matters. That's not extreme right. Now, I just want to go back to Hastie's leadership ambition, or alleged lack thereof, for a moment. In politics, perception is reality. And I will say he does himself no favours calling his colleagues muppets and cowards, as he did this week after anonymous Liberal sources were quoted in The Australian questioning who was influencing him and potentially paying to produce social media content for him. Sometimes, and I struggle with this too as someone in the public eye who cops criticism, but sometimes it's better to maintain a dignified silence or to simply laugh at these people. But as I said, perception is reality. And the perception at the moment is that Hastie is positioning himself for the leadership, something that he's publicly acknowledged he is interested in at some point, because he's saying more and getting more coverage than his leader, Sussan Ley. And on the matter of leadership, I'd say to Hastie that now is not the time. You don't want to get burnt too early, particularly when you're dealing with a government that has such a commanding majority. But does all this mean that Hastie is positioning himself for the leadership, or is it simply that in the absence of anything else, he's just about the only person in the coalition that the media have to report on? Sinodinos is right on one thing. which is that the coalition needs to come up with some cohesive policies.
Well, if you want to have an effective opposition, you have to be united. You have to speak with one voice. What all these people should be doing on the front bench, on the back bench of the Liberal Party at the moment, is putting their heads down and getting on with coming up with specific policies and keeping the government to account.
Now, this is the real problem. He's right. They should be coming up with specific policies and holding the government to account, but it's simply not happening. And so what? Are they all just meant to sit idly by in the meantime and watch Labor increase their lead in the polls without saying anything? And you can argue the toss over whether you think Hastie is saying the right things. By and large, I think he probably is. But if you're not giving him and others a comprehensive policy platform to sell, then what do you expect them to do? When Ley became opposition leader, she said everything was on the table. All policies are up for review. Well, we're a tick over 4 months later and there's no sign of any results from that review, and it doesn't seem like there will be any time soon. Just last week, Ley spoke at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia and she said, quote, "As we look to the 2028 election, the Coalition will present Australians with a positive plan to restore sound finances without losing sight of our compassion or our dynamism." As we look at the 2028 election, it's 3 years away. She went on, "As we have been clear, our policies are under review and we are undergoing a process of listening to the Australian people, meeting them where they are. While we'll work on this foundation through the term, I can say if we were in government today, our economic and fiscal strategy would be clear." I mean, fair dinkum. I get that you put big policies out before an election, but you can't just sit around for 3 years building your foundation and then hope that they'll work out what you're on about in the 4 weeks leading up to election day. You'd think they'd have learnt that lesson from the last election. Now, every now and again, Ley has come out with something decent, including in that speech where she said we need to reduce our reliance on the government. But there's no solid policy platform to speak of. So when you have people like Andrew Hastie coming out and directly addressing matters of policy and what the Liberal Party ought to adopt, then of course he's going to get media coverage. And in the absence of the leaders saying things and setting policy, then it'll lead to speculation that he wants the leadership. Former Liberal Senator Holly Hughes said to me on the Late Debate the other night that she gave them at least 5 fully costed policies before the last election, and there'd be myriad others sitting in the bottom drawer. So why don't they pull some of them out and start talking about something original, making themselves look like a proper alternative that can hold the government to account? And I hear people saying, give Sussan Ley a go. And sure, she deserves a go. But I think she's getting a go and she's not doing much with it at the moment. I mean, Ley could fix all of this up by giving the Liberal Party a policy platform, something to believe in. And yeah, they'll have internal fights over putting that together, as well they should. Scrutiny and debate is a good thing. But that should be happening as a matter of urgency, because you can't just expect people to sit idle in the meantime. Andrew Hastie is talking about policy because the party isn't talking about policy. If you're not happy with what Andrew Hastie is saying, you've got to give him something else to talk about. And they're just not doing it. And it's ridiculous that this early into the term we're even talking about someone else having leadership ambitions. But vacuums always get filled, whether deliberately or inadvertently. And at the moment, there is a very obvious vacuum. Sussan Ley, along with the party, can and should put that to bed.